Welcome to Breaking Green, a podcast by Global Justice Ecology Project. On Breaking Green, we will talk with activists and experts to examine the intertwined issues of social, ecological, and economic injustice. We will also explore some of the more outrageous proposals to address climate and environmental crises that are falsely being sold as green. I am your host, Steve Taylor. The Mapuche people have been mobilizing to reclaim their ancestral lands of Chile, which have been taken over by vast industrial eucalyptus and pine plantations established during the Pinochet dictatorship in the 1970s. This land recovery is part of a broader effort by the Mapuche to reclaim their culture, spirituality, language, and food sovereignty for their communities. However, a new usurpation law has made these land recovery efforts illegal, putting those who attempt to claim land or grow crops at risk of imprisonment. On this episode of Breaking Green, we will be speaking with Ann Petermann, who led a delegation to Chile in October of 2024 to interview Mapuche communities, activists, and political prisoners. Ann Petermann is Executive Director of Global Justice Ecology Project. She has been involved in movements for forest protection and indigenous rights since 1991 and the international and national climate justice movements since 2004. She participated in the founding of the Durban Group for Climate Justice in 2004 in Durban, South Africa, and Climate Justice Now in 2007 at the Bali, Indonesia UN Climate Conference. Petermann was adopted as an honorary member of the St. Francis Sokoke Band of the Abenaki in 1992 for her work in support of their struggle for state recognition. In 2000, she received the Wild Nature Award for Activists of the Year. Ann Petermann, welcome to Breaking Green.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve.
Ann Petermann, October 2024, you led a delegation to Chile. Please tell us a little bit about that.
This October was actually 20 years since the first time we went down to Chile, and this was our 7th time going to Chile. And we've been, very interested and involved in the Mapuche people's struggle against industrial pine plantations and eucalyptus plantations, which is part of our overall program of supporting indigenous peoples and their rights to have their own lands and not have their lands be taken over for timber plantations. And this particular delegation was a little bit different than other ones because we were specifically looking at the political repression by the government, by the military, et cetera, against the Mapuche people for trying to reclaim their lands.
So what do tree plantations have to do with a Mapuche indigenous struggle?
Well, the Mapuche people have been in Chile, for thousands of years, and then the Chilean government came along and there was an agreement with the Mapuche people that they could have all of the territory south of the Biobío River, which is a major river in Chile. And, that lasted, it didn't last all that long. In the 1860s, the government of Chile decided they wanted that territory, the Mapuche territory. So they took it through what they called, ironically, the pacification of the Araucanía. And the pacification program was actually a series of massacres and forced displacements where Mapuche people were put onto what they call reducciones, but in the United States would be thought of as reservations. So they lost a lot of their territory during that time, although much of the land was still ecologically intact. There were still native forests. It was still largely, the original condition of the land was okay. But then, Pinochet's dictatorship came along in 1973, and he subsidized the destruction of the Mapuche territory for pine plantations. So the government created this Law 701, this decree that allowed the timber companies to go in and just take over whatever land they wanted to and completely subsidized the planting of pine trees throughout Mapuche territory. So they lost, at the end of that period, they lost about 95% of their traditional land. And they didn't just lose it to other landowners that, continued to have it as forest. They lost it to these pine plantations that are ecologically decimating. They destroy the biodiversity, they deplete the water, they destroy the soil. It's been a real struggle for them. And as a result of that, because their land was lost in the 1970s to these industrial tree plantations in the 1990s, the people who were children when that happened, by the 1990s, they had watched their territory, their community's land be taken away for these plantations, watched the plantations mature, and they then became radicalized and decided to reclaim and restore the Mapuche people's culture, language, spirituality, and to take back that land.
Right. So there's a lot of tree plantations, monoculture tree plantations in Chile. So pine and eucalyptus, which we'll talk about fires a bit later, but there's a loss of biodiversity, there's fire threats. The Mapuche are struggling to take back land and to bring back indigenous forests. Am I correct about that?
Right, very much. Yeah, there's been a major campaign really since the 1990s for Mapuche people to get that land back. And not just because they want land for, building houses and the things that people in the United States think about having land for, but really to have the ability to sustain themselves, to be able to live lives that aren't in poverty. One of the side effects of all of these pine plantations and the loss of the land was that people could no longer feed themselves. They could no longer grow the crops that they had traditionally grown to feed their families and their communities. They couldn't raise livestock. And as a result, many of the Mapuche communities live below the poverty line. So it's been very important for people to get the land back just so they can live. And otherwise, it's just been a disaster. The pine plantation takeover of Mapuche territory has been a real disaster for the Mapuche people.
So, Anne, the word Wallmapu in the concept, what is that and what does it mean to the Mapuche, as far as you understand it?
Sure. Wallmapu is the traditional ancestral territory of the Mapuche. It encompasses not just their territory in Chile, but also territory in Argentina. The Mapuche people were in both countries. So it's the entirety of their ancestral land.
So, Anne, we talk about the Mapuche taking back land or attempting to take back land, their territory. What does that look like? Are there legal aspects? What type of struggle are we talking about?
There's a government entity called CONADI that was established specifically to deal with Mapuche land claims and to try to facilitate Mapuche people getting their land back. And it often involves the government buying land and giving it to Mapuche communities to have a place to be. And they've, done some of that, but it's largely been stalled. There's not been very much activity through CONADI to give people back their land. And so there's been a lot of frustration, communities waiting and waiting and waiting, and nothing's happening. And so there's been, other activities to take back land, like literally going into pine plantations and just taking the land and saying, this land has been ours for generations. We are taking the land back, and taking down the pine plantations and restoring the land either to some kind of a forest or more often to agricultural land so that people have the ability to grow their crops and raise livestock.
As the Mapuche take back some of their ancestral territory, they organize themselves into almost familial groups with a lonco. Could you talk a little bit about that?
They're very much oriented around family, and the lonco is the spiritual leader. So in some U.S. research, they're roughly called a chief, but it's not really like a chief. It's a spiritual leader. It's somebody that the community looks to help make decisions for the community, but they're not. It's not like a hierarchical thing. It's more of a spiritual thing. And the Mapuche loncos have a lot of responsibility for the communities to look after them, their well-being. But everybody in the community, it really feels, when we went to visit people, it really feels like everybody has a role to play. And a lot of the communities were talking about how the young people, the young men especially, but not just the young men, the young women as well, were being targeted in these communities that had taken back land that we visited, had been targeted for arrest, without really any cause. Some action would happen somewhere, and these young people would be arrested without real evidence or justification and put in prison. And what we learned when we visited people in prison and talked to their families is that it's called preventative prison, which is a pretty kind of a grotesque term, if you ask me. But preventative prison means that you can be in jail, put in prison in Chile, and be there for 2 years without being formally charged or having a trial. So, people are just being snatched off the streets, quite literally, put in jail and kept there as a way to cut off the movement to reclaim land, to either frighten other people away from it or literally just take away the activists who are involved.
So you visited some prisons when you were in Chile.
We did, yes. We started out, the first place we went actually on our delegation was the prison in Temuco. Temuco is the largest city in Mapuche territory in Chile. And we started out there. We met with, probably about 12 political prisoners, and a few of their family members were let in with us. So we had a very, a long and a rich conversation with them about the conditions of the prison, but also the condition of why they were there, and many of them repeated what I just said earlier about having been grabbed off the street or arrested without cause and being held there, not even being allowed to be in person in the courtroom. So being on video, doing these video trials, these virtual trials where they don't even get to sit next to their lawyer when they're being, charged in court or when they're going through the different court proceedings. So, and they challenged that. They tried to challenge it under the Constitution because it's unconstitutional in Chile. But it was defended by the government saying that it was for safety reasons. So it was something that was instituted under COVID, a lot of these virtual court hearings, and then after COVID, they just kept it for the Mapuche activists.
In Chile, there's actually regions where there's different rules of engagement for the Mapuche than in other places are for other segments of society. I think I've heard them referred to as red zones and loose trigger laws. Could you tell us about that?
In the territories in Chile, the Biobío region in particular, the Araucanía region, these are regions where there has been a lot of Mapuche activism to reclaim land. And as a result of that, especially since the People's Uprising in 2019, there's been a militarization of those territories. So the government has said, you know what, we've had enough of this Mapuche land reclaiming, probably because the timber industry is putting a lot of pressure on the government, saying, we don't really like this in our what they call their territory. So yeah, there's been a lot of militarization. The Biobío region in particular has had a lot of violence from the police toward people. There's been a huge military presence. People who are activists there talk about being surveilled by drones, that if they drive down the street, the police pull them over for no reason, that they can't actually go out of their communities or they fear they'll be arrested. So yeah, there's a lot of militarization. And of course, the government spins it as they need the militarization because the Mapuche are such terrible, violent people. And so they warn tourists, for example, not to go there. That's what you were referring to about being the red zone. This is a red zone. Don't go there. It's very bad. We were in the red zone and it was, people were lovely. The only thing that was scary was the police, their big armored vehicles and, driving around, and you're never quite sure what they're going to do. But so there's, especially since the People's Uprising in 2019, when not just Mapuches, but people across Chile rose up en masse to demand an end to neoliberalism and an end to the economic system that was crushing everybody's ability to live. Ever since then, there's been an especially large military presence in the Mapuche territories.
a lot of the traditional Mapuche land is now being controlled by forestry companies. And I believe originally some forestry was more public, but then under Pinochet they privatized it, and then they took more Mapuche land.
Yeah, there was Salvador Allende, who was the more socialist president that was overthrown in a U.S.-backed coup by Pinochet. He was trying to make a lot of the land public, and under public ownership, he was creating publicly owned pulp mills, for example, to create paper for internal use in Chile. He gave the Mapuches back land. Allende did. He created a land reform policy that gave the Mapuches back 850,000 acres of land. So, there was a really positive trajectory going on under Allende. And then when Pinochet came in and Allende was killed, that was all just kind of switched off, almost like a faucet. It just stopped, and then everything was reversed. It was quite, very shocking to see. But then the pulp mills that Allende created to be publicly owned pulp mills, of course, were privatized. And now that's what we're seeing in the Mapuche territories, this huge pulp mill there called Arauco, which is one of the biggest in the world, that is, just devouring the land with their pine plantations because their demand for raw material is so huge.
Did some of the Mapuche address the impact of that industrial agriculture on their culture?
Yeah, absolutely. The industrial agriculture, the industrial pine plantations in particular, have had a huge impact on the Mapuche culture. Their culture was, for centuries, very much wedded or intertwined with the forests. Their medicine came from the forest. Many of their foods came from the forest. The dyes they used for their clothing came from the forest. Everything came from the forest. Everything was intertwined with the forest. And so when the forests were taken away, when they were taken out of the forest, and then the forests were turned into pine plantations, this caused tremendous hardship for the Mapuche people. And that's why much of the Mapuche culture was lost during that so-called pacification period when Mapuches were removed from their land and many people were massacred. They literally lost their connection to the land because they were taken away from it. So when the young people came back in the 90s and said, we want to restore our culture, we want to restore our language, we need to have land. We need to have our land to make all of that happen. And so that's been a huge part of this land reclaim effort. It's not just about having land, it's about having language, culture, spirituality, and all of those traditions that the Mapuche people lost over the years because of the repression and violence of the state.
It would be nice to hear the words of the Mapuche. So did GJEP, the Global Justice Ecology Project, do any field reporting on this?
We did. And that was one of the specific intentions of our delegation, was not just to go and talk to people and hear what they had to say, but to record what they had to say. So through video, and through audio, through photography, we recorded what people were talking about, what they were showing us, what their experience was. And one of the things that we did when we met with each community or each activist was say, we don't want to speak for you. We don't want to be the ones saying what you are experiencing, what you're feeling. We want you to tell your own stories. And so that was part of the whole thing. And so we came back from there with, an enormous amount of material. Now, of course, it's the challenge of sifting through it and figuring out what we're going to do with it, and how to make the best use of it. But people were really open with us. And part of what opened the door, which was really interesting, was we have a book called Portraits of Struggle, which documents Indigenous and other struggles over the past 50 years. And a number of the struggles that were depicted in the book were from Chile. And so we have a Spanish version of the book. We gave it to each community, Lonco, whenever we visited a community or an activist. We gave it to them. And, it really opened up people's trust with us, not just that we've been going there for 20 years, but that we have documented what has been going on in Chile with their own communities. And as a result of that, people were really open with us. They really told us what they're experiencing, their fears about the repression, their hopes for the future, the schools that they're building. I mean, it was really, it opened up the dialogue in a way that I don't think would have been possible otherwise.
You met with political prisoners. The Mapuche consider the people imprisoned from their cause political prisoners. So you met with Mapuche political prisoners, and there must have been translation. So you're meeting in this prison. How was the prison meeting done logistically? Was there translation? What was going on?
Yeah, we were very happy to be able to have the opportunity to go into the prisons and talk to the prisoners themselves. And that was, we had a person in Chile who was helping coordinate everything for us. And, it was amazing that he was able to make that happen. But yes, we went into the prison. We weren't allowed to bring anything to video or take photos or audio or anything like that, but we were allowed to take notes. So we took a lot of notes while we were in there. And one of the people that was with us was there specifically to ask the prisoners about torture. Had they been tortured? He was with a committee about torture, so he was collecting that kind of data. We were talking to them about, why were they there? What was going on with the repression? What were the situations in the prison? We met with one of the founders of one of the Mapuche activist youth groups from the 1990s named GJEP, and he talked to us about his situation, being a leader and being arrested basically for being a leader, for being a spokesperson, not for any actions, but just for what he said, literally in prison for what he said, and how the Mapuche people are being disrespected in the prison and that it's violating their international rights in the prisons because they're not allowed to be in groups with other Mapuche people. They're not allowed to practice their spirituality. They're not allowed to have their traditional foods. So all of these things that make it more difficult for them as Mapuche people, all the way to not being allowed to have their traditional medicines. And that's a big deal because one of the ways that Mapuche people in prison put pressure on the authorities to get concessions, whether it's to be moved closer to their families or whatever, is through hunger strikes. And, these hunger strikes often go on for a very long time and have a lot of long-term health impacts on the people who participate in them. And so Hector Yetul was talking to us about all of the different hunger strikes he's been on to try to get these concessions, and they've had all of these physical tolls on him, and he's not allowed to have his traditional medicine, which he feels is, a form of torture to not allow him to be able to, address his physical problems with his traditional medicines. Anyway, it was very interesting talking to the prisoners and listening to what they're going through, and then we met with their families and heard from their families what their families are going through because their loved ones are in prison.
So you also met with a political prisoner who, through a hunger strike, was moved closer to his community in some sort of agrarian prison, correct?
Yeah, that was interesting. So this was one of these types of prisons where you're allowed to go out of the prison and work during the day. Then you have to come back to the prison at night and be in the prison, when you're not actually out in the world working. He was very interesting. And, he talked to us a lot about the political situation with Mapuches in Chile. And, that was nice because we were actually able to get video and photo of him because he was in this sort of lower security situation. So that was interesting. And he showed us his garden and his greenhouse and his workshop. And so that was interesting.
So Ann Petermann, was there any big takeaway, singular takeaway from your visit with the Mapuche political prisoners?
I would say it's this idea of preventative prison, that people can be picked up and just held for 2 years, which we ran into that actually in 2019 when we were down there during the People's Uprising. We were able to be in the courtroom when Alberto Coramil, who was a Goldman Prize winner, was being tried for this ridiculous crime. I think he was tried for robbing a convenience store or something with a fellow working. He's actually a Lonco Coramil, and he had won the Goldman Prize because he had successfully stopped hydroelectric dams on the Cautín River, which is a sacred Mapuche river, and as a result of being so successful in stopping these dams, he was put in prison, on these trumped up charges. And he sat there in prison for 18 months before he had a trial. And his daughter actually had to accept the Goldman Award in his stead because he was still in prison when the Goldman Award was given to him in 2019. So, yeah, this is not a new thing for the Mapuche people. This is a tactic that the state has been using to take activists out of the way and out of the way of development or whatever. But it's not just, of course, in Chile. We see this with land defenders, indigenous land defenders all over the world, that they are targeted for violence and prison just for defending their lands.
We talked to you about Brazil also. There's a lot of industrial agriculture in Brazil, and we have industrial agriculture in Chile. We have indigenous struggle in both countries, and both of those industries started under dictatorship.
Correct. Yeah, that's something that isn't very widely known, but yeah, there's a direct correlation between dictatorships and industrial monoculture tree plantations, and not just in Brazil and not just in Chile, but we saw that with apartheid in South Africa. In other countries in Latin America, when they had dictatorships, tree plantations came in. Indonesia, this is a pattern. The dictatorship comes in, people's land is stolen from them and given to industrial timber plantations. Other things as well, but a lot of the land goes to these tree plantations.
So we've spoken a lot about the Mapuche culture, the Mapuche struggle. But overall, these industrial tree plantations are affecting a whole variety of people and communities with fire. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, that's something that in Chile is a very, very big deal. Global Justice Ecology Project went down on a different delegation in 2017, and this was shortly after the worst wildfires in the country's history, which was over the 2016-2017, our winter, their summer. And they were the worst wildfires ever recorded, and they started in timber plantations and eucalyptus and pine plantations. Both eucalyptus trees and pine trees are incredibly flammable, and they both are extremely water intensive. So with the added bonus of climate change driving the heat waves, you end up with these extremely these really flammable situations where a strike of lightning or somebody throwing their cigarette out the window or whatever cause these huge conflagrations that are, more than just a wildfire. They call them firestorms, or they call them megafires. They're so massive. They just destroy entire communities. They destroy the plantations. They destroy native forest. They destroy so much. And now they're saying, it's gotten even worse since that time. The 2023 fires were even worse, and they went from calling them megafires to gigafires because they're just so intense. And many people were killed in the 2023 fires. So this is something that's not just impacting the indigenous communities or the rural communities. It's the 2023 fires were in an area that was very touristy, kind of like these Los Angeles fires that we just had in California. They don't, wildfires aren't super particular about who they target. It's more where you live. And in Chile, there's just so many plantations all over the place in these regions that it's very dangerous to live there because of the fire danger.
Did you talk to any non-Mapuche communities that were affected by fire?
Yes. In 2017, when we were there, we did a whole actual tour looking at communities that had been impacted by wildfire. And so we met with many people. I don't think we met with any Mapuche people at that time who had been directly impacted by fire, but we met with a lot of communities that had lost, a lot of families, I should say, that had lost their homes, that had lost their orchards, their gardens, their livelihoods because of these fires. And we saw with our own eyes the scorched earth, which was interesting because where the eucalyptus had burned down, they were already resprouting. So, in the native forest, it's going to take a very long time for the native forest to come back from being burned like that. But the eucalyptus, that's a fire that, they are evolved with fire. It's a fire dependent species. And so they were already starting to come back. The trees that caused the fire were already returning.
What was the response to your trip in the media?
This last trip, we started out with a press conference after the meeting with the political prisoners in Temuco. We did a press conference outside with some of the family members of the political prisoners. And the point was to kind of illuminate this racism of the judicial system in Chile, which really targets Mapuche people and puts them through a lot more legal rigors than they do other people. So, we got the largest media in that Mapuche territory, which is called BOBO Radio. So that was a really worthwhile endeavor, and not just for GJEP, of course, but for the families to talk about their political prisoner relatives. The people in Chile, the Mapuche people, really get a hard time in the press. I mean, while we were there, just the response to that story, there were so many haters on the social media of BOBO Radio, even some haters on our own Global Justice Ecology Project social media. They just get an unbelievably unfair shake from the media. The fact that we were able to put a little bit more into the media from their perspective was good. I felt like that was a very positive thing that we were able to do.
What is the usurpation law that's being used so much against the Mapuche?
Yeah, so this is a new one. The Mapuche people have been trying to reclaim their land for quite a while, and the government has been getting, I guess you could say, less and less enthusiastic about it. And so they've actually created a law now called the Usurpation Law, which makes it illegal to do these land occupations. So one of the women that we met with, a woman named Sarah, was the first person arrested in her region under the usurpation law, and she's going to trial right now for plowing her land. She was arrested for plowing her land, and the person who owned the tractor was arrested as well. So, it's really this absurd law that actually in and of itself is illegal. This is an illegal law. It violates international indigenous rights laws, such as ILO 169, which gives indigenous peoples the rights to have land. And it violates the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is much more strong in giving indigenous peoples the rights to land and water and so forth. And Chile has signed on to both of those. It's ratified both of those things. And yet they passed this law that violates both of those international treaties. So people are really rising up against the usurpation law, trying to raise awareness about it. And Global Justice Ecology Project is trying to help with that as much as possible. We have an action alert that closes today. Well, today being the day that we're doing the interview, on the 28th of February, which is demanding that the Boric government repeal the usurpation law, that Sarah, who is being tried, that her charges are dropped, that no one else is tried under this law, and trying to raise awareness about the fact that it sets such a dangerous precedent by saying that, countries can pass laws that violate these international agreements. So we're watching that very carefully. We understand that March is going to be a big month for political prisoners in Chile, political Mapuche prisoners in Chile. So we're keeping an eye on that and doing as much as we can to support the struggle of the Mapuche people to take their land back, which is their right as indigenous people and cannot be taken away from them by these ridiculous laws like the usurpation law.
Also, there's been somewhat of a back and forth legally. I mean, the Allende government gave Mapuche back their land. And then it was taken back it was taken back by the Pinochet government. So, and there was actually some treaty, too, that is not being respected regarding the Mapuche.
So 2 centuries ago, there was a treaty that was signed with the Mapuche people called the Tepiwe Treaty that gave them all of the territory south of the Biobío River in Chile, which is a huge territory, which was, their traditional land. And then it was only, 35, 40 years after that the government of Chile decided they wanted that land back. They didn't want the Mapuches to have that land, and so they launched the pacification of the Araucanía when they went in and displaced people, put them in reservations, and massacred large numbers of people. So it's been the situation with the Mapuche has been a real roller coaster over the years, more off than on, as far as, getting their rights back. But people are determined. This is not something that they're going to give up. They're not going to give up their right to have ancestral territory and a place to grow food and have livestock and a culture and a spiritual existence that is their own.
Ann Petermann, thank you for joining us on Breaking Green.
Thank you so much, Steve. This was really fun.
You have been listening to Breaking Green, a Global Justice Ecology Project podcast. To learn more about Global Justice Ecology Project, visit globaljusticeecology.org. Breaking Green is made possible by tax-deductible donations by people like you. Please help us lift up the voices of those working to protect forests, defend human rights, and expose false solutions. Simply text GIVE, G-I-V-E, to 1-716-257-4187. That's 1-716-257-4187.